In the winter of 1964, while the Pacific Ocean churned under a moonless sky, the American destroyer USS Harbinger sliced through black waters 100 miles from Guadalcanal, unaware that something forgotten and damned was waiting far below its hull. Because when the sonar operator first heard the slow, rhythmic tapping echoing through the steel belly of the ship, it did not sound like drifting debris or underwater currents, but like a desperate hand striking metal from the inside. Each knock, spaced with human intent. And Captain Robert Hale immediately knew this was no mechanical glitch, for he had fought in the last years of the war and had learned that the ocean never makes mistakes when it speaks. Only men do when they ignore it. So he ordered silence on the bridge as the sound grew louder, a hollow hammering that seemed to climb upward from the abyss, as though something buried alive was clawing its way back toward the light. And when the sonar depth revealed a massive metallic shape resting on the ocean floor, every man on board felt their blood run cold, because it was not a wreck from recent years, but a war relic, a World War II submarine that had been listed as destroyed nearly 2 decades earlier. The USS Blackfin, a vessel lost with all hands during a brutal naval ambush in 1944, yet now, impossibly, something inside it was knocking as if its crew had never died. And Chief Diver Samuel Kincaid was lowered into the water through churning waves, his helmet light, cutting through the darkness as he descended into history itself. And when he finally reached the silent, barnacle-covered hull of the Blackfin, he heard the knocking with his own ears, vibrations traveling through his bones like a heartbeat that was not his own. And with trembling gloves, he tapped back against the steel, 3 slow strikes. And in response, the knocking stopped, as if whatever was inside had suddenly realized it was no longer alone. And that moment of silence was more terrifying than any noise could ever be, because when the tapping resumed, it was faster now, frantic, as though the dead were screaming without voices. And as Kincaid moved along the submarine's corroded hull, he discovered a dog tag wedged near a shattered porthole, its metal worn, but its name still visible, belonging to Chief Radio Operator Thomas Bell, a man who was not supposed to exist anymore. Yet standing on the deck of the Harbinger at that very moment was a living Chief Bell, a gray-haired veteran who had survived the war and carried a lifetime of guilt on his shoulders. And when the diver brought the tag back up, Bell's face drained of all color, because it was his, lost the night the Blackfin went down, the night he had accidentally exposed their position with a faulty signal, condemning his entire crew to a fiery death beneath the waves. And now, 20 years later, the ocean had returned his sin to him in the form of those relentless knocks. And as Bell stared at the tag, he swore he could hear their voices whispering from the deep, calling him to finish what he had started. While below the ship, far beneath the living, the dead continued to pound against their iron coffin, waiting for the one man who had escaped them to finally come home. In the dimly lit corridors of the USS Harbinger, Chief Thomas Bell sat alone in the mess hall, staring at the rusted dog tag resting in his trembling palm, its cold metal burning him like a brand of judgment as the distant knocking from beneath the ship continued to echo faintly through the steel hull. Because even though the sonar crew had shut off the speakers, the sound had already lodged itself deep inside Bell's mind, repeating over and over like a sentence being read by the ghosts of the men he had failed. And as memories surged through him, he was no longer an old sailor in 1964, but a terrified signalman in 1944 standing on the tower of the USS Blackfin, while rain lashed his face and enemy destroyers prowled the darkness around them. Because he remembered fumbling with the infrared filter on his signal lamp, dropping it for just a second that had allowed a beam of white light to spill into the night and betray their position, and moments later Japanese shells had ripped into the submarine, throwing Bell from the tower into the Black Sea while the Blackfin burned and sank with everyone still inside. And he had survived not because he deserved it, but because the ocean had chosen him as the one man who would have to live forever with what he had done. And now, as Bell rose from his chair and walked slowly through the Harbinger's narrow passageways, the air itself seemed to grow colder with every step, lights flickering overhead as though something unseen was passing through them, because sailors began to whisper that they were seeing shadows moving where no one stood. and some swore they heard footsteps following them through empty corridors. But no one felt it more strongly than Bell, who could feel invisible eyes boring into his back as if the dead crew of the Blackfin had finally found him again. And when he reached the observation deck overlooking the ocean, he stared down at the dark water and felt an overwhelming pull, as though the sea itself was calling his name, promising him an end to the guilt if he would only surrender to it. And far below, the Blackfin waited like a tomb that refused to stay sealed, its knocking growing louder and more rhythmic, matching the beating of Bell's heart, until Captain Hale confronted him, demanding to know why Bell was shaking like a man who had seen death itself. And when Bell finally confessed the truth of that long-ago mistake, the bridge fell silent, because every man realized that the sound coming from the deep was not just metal being struck, it was the memory of a massacre demanding justice. And as night fell over, the harbinger of the ocean grew unnaturally calm, as though holding its breath, while Bell found himself wandering back toward the rail again and again, unable to resist the urge to stand at the edge and listen. And he swore he could hear their voices rising up through the waves, whispering his name with both rage and sorrow, until at last he saw something in the water, a faint shape beneath the surface, dozens of pale figures standing where the Blackfin lay, their ghostly faces turned upward, their hollow eyes fixed on him. And in that moment, Bell knew, with absolute certainty, that the knocking was not coming from trapped survivors, but from something far worse, something that could not rest because it had been wronged. And as the ship drifted over the haunted wreck, Bell felt his final choice closing in on him, because the dead were not asking for rescue, they were asking for him. As dawn crept weakly over the Pacific, the USS Harbinger no longer felt like a warship, but like a floating coffin drifting above a grave that refused to stay silent, because the knocking from the Blackfin below had begun to change in rhythm. No longer random or desperate, but deliberate, almost intelligent, as if something down there was slowly learning how to speak. And inside the ship's sailors reported lights flickering on and off in empty compartments, doors opening without hands, and the sound of boots walking through corridors where no one stood. And while Captain Hale tried to keep order, fear was spreading through the crew faster than any enemy attack, because war had taught them how to face bullets and torpedoes, but not how to face something that could move through steel like mist. And Chief Bell, haunted by visions of his long-dead shipmates, found himself unable to sleep as he heard their voices whispering through the ventilation ducts, calling him traitor, murderer, survivor, until he wandered down into the lower decks where the air was colder and the shadows were deeper. And there he saw something that made his blood freeze, a figure standing at the end of the corridor wearing the faded blue utility uniform of World War II, its face hidden in darkness, its boots silent against the deck. And Bell knew, without needing to be told, that this was one of the men who had died because of him. And when he stepped forward, the figure did not move, only lifted a pale hand and pointed downward, toward the ocean beneath their feet. And suddenly the walls around Bell seemed to dissolve into the memory of the Blackfin's final moments, as fire and water poured into the submarine, as sailors screamed and prayed and drowned, and Bell collapsed to his knees, clutching his head as the past and present collided inside his mind, while above him the Harbinger shuddered, as though something massive had brushed against its hull, because deep below the wreck of the Blackfin had begun to release something into the water, a dark, swirling cloud that did not behave like oil or silt, but like a living thing, creeping upward toward the surface, wrapping itself around the Harbinger's shadow. And in the engine room, sailors felt a sudden cold sweep through the air, extinguishing flames and frosting over metal surfaces, while invisible hands seemed to reach out of the walls, leaving behind streaks of frozen salt. And as panic erupted, Captain Hale ordered all hands to emergency stations, but even as alarms blared, the ship felt trapped, as though the sea itself had closed around it, refusing to let it escape the curse tied to the Blackfin. And Chief Bell, now certain that the dead were no longer content to simply knock, realized that they were using him as a doorway, feeding on his guilt, his memory, his connection to them, to cross from their watery tomb into the world of the living. And when he reached the bridge, he told Hale the truth, that the Blackfin was not haunted by ghosts, but by something far more dangerous, a force born from the rage, terror, and betrayal of 100 drowned souls, something that wanted more than remembrance, something that wanted restitution. And as if to confirm his words, a dark shape rose briefly from the waves alongside the Harbinger. Its form twisted and unnatural, half human and half something else, its eyes glowing with a cold, drowned light, before slipping back beneath the surface. And in that moment, every man on board understood that the war they were about to fight was not against another nation, but against the past itself, a past that refused to stay buried. And as the knocking from below grew louder than ever, echoing through the ship like a heartbeat, Bell realized with a terrible clarity that the only way to end it would be for him to return to the place where it had all begun, because the dead did not want the Harbinger. They wanted him. The sea was eerily calm as Chief Bell stood on the deck of the USS Harbinger in a heavy diving suit, the black water stretching endlessly beneath him like an open mouth waiting to swallow him whole. Because every man on board knew that what was about to happen was not a rescue mission, but a reckoning. And even though Captain Hale tried to argue that there had to be another way, Bell knew there wasn't. As the knocking from the Blackfin below had grown so violent that it now shook the ship, rattling bolts and sending ripples across the surface. And Bell could feel his long-dead crew pulling at his soul as if invisible chains were already wrapped around him, dragging him back to where he belonged. So with one final look at the living world, he stepped off the edge and plunged into the freezing depths, descending through a column of darkness lit only by the weak beam of his helmet lamp. While above him, the Harbinger shrank into a distant silhouette, and below him, the massive shape of the Blackfin slowly emerged, its hull cracked and corroded but still imposing, like a war beast that refused to die. And as Bell drifted closer, he began to see them, ghostly figures floating around the wreck, dozens of pale sailors suspended in the water as though time had forgotten them, their uniforms torn, their faces hollow but unmistakably human, and yet something about their eyes was wrong, as if whatever kept them here was no longer truly them. And when Bell reached the hull and placed his gloved hand against it, the knocking suddenly stopped, replaced by a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from inside the submarine itself, as though the Blackfin was breathing, and a hatch that had been sealed for 20 years slowly creaked open, spilling out a dark mist that wrapped around Bell like cold fingers, pulling him inside, where the corridors were flooded but still intact, filled with drifting debris and the frozen remains of sailors caught in their final moments. And as Bell moved through this underwater tomb, he saw visions of the past playing out around him, the attack, the explosions, the screams, all repeating endlessly like a nightmare that could not end, until he reached the radio room, where the signal lamp he had dropped so many years ago lay resting on a table, untouched by time, glowing faintly as though still transmitting the fatal light that had doomed them all. And there, standing beside it, was the first of the dead to fully take shape, a sailor whose face Bell recognized immediately, one of his closest friends, now twisted by something dark and ancient that had grown within the wreck, feeding on their fear and anger until it had become something monstrous. And the sailor spoke without moving his lips, his voice echoing directly inside Bell's mind, telling him that the ocean had claimed them, but his guilt had kept them trapped, unable to move on, and that the only way to free them was for Bell to finally accept his punishment. And as more spirits gathered around him, forming a circle of pale, drowned faces, Bell realized that this was what the knocking had been all along. Not a cry for help, but a summons calling him back to the grave he had escaped. And with tears streaming down his face inside his helmet, he removed the dog tag from around his neck and placed it beside the signal lamp, symbolically returning himself to the Blackfin. And as he did, the dark force that had taken hold of the dead began to recoil because it fed on unresolved guilt. And now that Bell had faced his, it was losing its power. And in a blinding surge of light, the spirits of the Blackfin were released from their twisted state, their forms becoming calm and human once more as they began to fade. And Bell felt a deep peace wash over him as he finally forgave himself. Even as the water rushed in and his breathing slowed, and above, on the Harbinger, the knocking stopped forever. When the ocean finally went still again, it was as though the Pacific itself had exhaled after holding its breath for 20 years. Because above the wreck of the Blackfin, the USS Harbinger floated in a silence so deep that even the wind seemed afraid to disturb it. And the sonar room confirmed what every man on board already felt in his bones. The knocking was gone. The unnatural vibrations had ceased, and the dark presence that had surrounded them was no longer there. Yet the cost of that. Peace weighed heavily on the crew as they realized that Chief Bell had not returned from the depths. His sacrifice sealing the haunted submarine and whatever horror had been bound to it back into the grave where it belonged. And as Captain Hale ordered the ship to pull away from the area, a strange light shimmered briefly on the surface of the water, like a reflection from a world just beyond their own. And for a fleeting moment, several sailors swore they could see figures standing on the waves, saluting the Harbinger before fading into nothing. And whether it was imagination or the last farewell of the Blackfin's crew, no one could say. But every man on that ship felt a sense of closure that war rarely grants, because the ghosts of the past had finally been allowed to rest. Yet even as the Harbinger steamed toward home, the ocean was not finished telling its stories. For weeks later, rumors began to spread among submariners and sailors alike about other boats, other wrecks, and other spirits that refused to let go of their unfinished business. And it became clear that what had happened with the Blackfin was not an isolated incident, but part of a far darker pattern. Because war leaves scars not just on the living, but on the very places where it is fought. And the deep sea, filled with the bones of ships and men alike, had become a vast cemetery haunted by memories too powerful to fade. And one of those haunted vessels was a modern nuclear submarine known as the USS Meridian, which years after the Blackfin incident began to experience its own strange occurrences, from shadows moving through missile compartments to cold spots that no heating system could explain, and sailors reported seeing a man in an outdated uniform wandering the engine rooms late at night, his face always hidden, his footsteps echoing softly before vanishing into thin air. And when records were checked, it was discovered that decades earlier a sailor had taken his own life aboard the Meridian. While on watch, his body found in the same compartment where the ghost was now being seen. And though the Navy officially dismissed these stories as stress-induced hallucinations, those who served on the Meridian knew better, because fear has a distinct shape when it stands right in front of you. And they had seen it, felt it, just as the crew of the Harbinger had felt the presence of the Blackfin. And so the legacy of haunted warships continued, passed down through whispered stories and mess, halls and engine rooms. Because when men die violently and without closure, especially in the crushing darkness of the ocean, something of them remains behind, clinging to the steel and the salt as though unwilling to be forgotten. And somewhere deep below the waves, in wrecks scattered across the seafloor, the echoes of war still knock, still whisper, still wait for those who are connected to them by blood, guilt, or memory. And even though Chief Bell had found his peace, the world had not yet learned how to let go of its dead. And as the Harbinger sailed toward the horizon, its crew forever changed. The ocean behind them shimmered with hidden stories, each one more terrifying than the last, promising that no matter how far humanity travels or how advanced its machines become, the past will always find a way to reach up from the depths and remind us of what we have done. Long after the USS Harbinger returned to port and the story of the Blackfin was quietly buried under classified reports and nervous silence, the men who had been there carried a shadow with them into every new assignment. Because once you have heard the dead knocking from beneath the sea, you never truly forget it. And across the world, in different oceans and on different submarines, sailors began to experience things that felt eerily connected, as if the ocean itself had been awakened by what had happened, stirring memories that had been locked away in its depths for generations. And on the USS Meridian, the ghostly sailor in the outdated uniform continued to roam the lower levels, appearing most often during the quietest hours of the mid-watch when the boat was shut down and the only sound were the hum of reactors and the distant rush of water against steel. And those who encountered him described the same overwhelming feeling of being watched, of standing in the presence of something that was not entirely human anymore. Because war does not end when the last shot is fired. It simply changes shape, lingering in the minds of survivors and in the places where blood was spilled, and submarines, sealed steel worlds drifting through eternal darkness, are perfect vessels for such memories to fester, because they are built to survive crushing pressure, but not the weight of the past. And as more stories surface from boats like the USS Maryland, the USS Rhode Island, and others, sailors whispered about moving signs, faceless apparitions, and shadows that ran between missile tubes only to vanish when approached. All of them linked to tragedies that had occurred years earlier, suicides, accidents, and wartime losses that had never been fully acknowledged. And though the Navy tried to maintain its image of order and control, those who lived below the surface knew that some things could not be regulated or erased, because grief, fear, and guilt have a way of sinking into metal just as deeply as water seeps into a wreck. And in Pearl Harbor, where so many warships rested like sleeping giants, dock workers spoke of seeing figures moving through sealed compartments late at night, as if the ghosts of old sailors were still performing their duties, unwilling to accept that their war was over. And even museums built from retired submarines were not immune, as visitors and staff alike reported shimmering shapes and strange chills when walking through the narrow passageways, as though the spirits of those who had died aboard still lingered. Watching the living with quiet, unseen eyes, and all of these stories from different places and different decades shared a single haunting truth, that the ocean does not forget, and neither do the vessels that have carried men into its depths to fight and die. And as the years passed, the legend of the Blackfin became something of a whispered warning among submariners, a reminder that some missions never truly end, and that sometimes the greatest danger is not an enemy fleet, but the unresolved ghosts of one's own past. And somewhere out there, far beneath the waves, rusting hulls lie scattered across the seafloor like gravestones, each one holding its own dark memories, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. Because as long as there are sailors willing to descend into the deep, there will always be stories of what waits for them in the darkness. Stories of boats that remember, and of souls that refuse to be forgotten. Years after the Blackfin was finally silenced, the sea continued to whisper its secrets to those who were willing or cursed enough to listen. Because no matter how far technology advanced or how many new submarines were launched into the deep, the ocean remained a vast, living archive of human conflict, preserving every scream, every betrayal, and every final breath within its endless black depths. And sailors who spent long months beneath the surface began to understand that they were not just traveling through water, but through layers of memory, passing over battlefields that had never truly been cleared. And on one quiet patrol aboard a ballistic missile submarine in the early 1980s, a young sailor felt a familiar chill crawl up his spine as he walked through the missile compartment, sensing a presence that was not listed on any watch bill. And though he never saw anything, he knew in his heart that something ancient and sorrowful was moving just out of sight, just as it had on the Harbinger so many years before. Because war leaves echoes that travel through time as easily as sound travels through water. And in that way, the spirits of the Blackfin and countless other lost crews were not confined to their wrecks, but were woven into the very fabric of the sea, appearing wherever steel and sorrow came together. And some old submariners believed that these apparitions were not evil, but simply lost, trapped between worlds by unfinished business, while others swore they were something darker, twisted by the agony of their deaths into entities that fed on fear. But whatever their true nature, one thing was certain: they could never be fully escaped, because the ocean has no mercy for those who try to forget it. And as the years turned into decades, the stories of haunted submarines became part of naval folklore, passed down from one generation of sailors to the next. Each tale a reminder that beneath the waves lies not just the physical wreckage of war, but its emotional wreckage as well. And even today, when a submarine glides silently through the deep, its crew surrounded by darkness and pressure, there are moments when a sailor will feel a sudden cold, or hear a faint sound where there should be none. And in those moments, the past reaches out, brushing against the present like a ghostly hand. And far below, in places where sunlight has never touched, rusted hulls still lie where they fell, holding within them the last thoughts and fears of the men who died there. And though their names may fade from history books, the sea remembers them all, preserving their stories in its endless depths. And perhaps that is why the ocean sometimes knocks back, why it sends shadows and whispers into the metal hearts of the ships that cross it, because it refuses to let the sacrifices of the dead be forgotten. And in that way, even though Chief Bell and the crew of the Blackfin found their peace, they became part of something far larger, a timeless chorus of voices beneath the waves, reminding the living that every war leaves ghosts, and every ghost leaves a mark. And as long as humanity continues to send its sons into the deep to fight, the ocean will continue to answer, not with silence, but with the soft, relentless echo of memory, tapping gently against the steel, waiting to be heard.